I'm Dave Spencer, and Alan Godian has been working in the back with the photographs. The pictures in the back are very much the ones that I'll be using today in the presentation, plus some more. The topic for today is the history of Groton Pond. As shown here, just for orientation, we refer to the top of the pond as the head, the bottom as the foot, and the west shore is to the left and the east shore is to the right. And a little bit about the state forest. The state forest has 27,000 acres, and it's the second largest state forest in the state of Vermont. Many people are not aware of a recent acquisition in 2015. They added another 1,000 acres to the state forest with the addition of Molly's Pond Falls State Park, and that's over on Route 2. That pond is 400 acres, about the same size as Groton Pond. So that's a very nice addition to the state forest. In looking at the history of Groton Pond, it actually starts back in the 1800s. The early 1800s, the focus of the country was travel infrastructure. There were no railroads at that time, no trucks, and so the major challenge to the country was transporting goods and people from place to place. And the one thing they had was water. And in 1825, the Erie Canal was completed, and it was successful and got everyone excited about canals. And so subsequent to that, in 1830, they did a survey of this area to determine whether a canal was feasible between the Wells River and the Winooski River over on the other side of the mountains. The objective was to get a transport path to Lake Champlain from Boston or from outside the New England area. In looking at that, they did a feasibility study of linking Groton Pond to the Wells River and on to Kettle Pond, but they determined that it wasn't really feasible because there wasn't sufficient water flow given the elevation that they had to deal with. At that time, it's interesting, they were transporting through the canals on the Connecticut River up as far as Barnet. Barnet was the practical limit at that time. It's very interesting. In looking at the chronology of lake history or pond history, the history really starts in 1873 with the advent of the Montpelier and Wells River Railroad being completed through the forest, and that opened up a whole new vista for this area. And it wasn't just the forest, it was for Groton, it was for Marshfield, Plainfield, and the railroad was primarily funded through bonds paid for by Groton and Plainfield and Marshfield, as well as Montpelier. The train was a major factor to Groton, but in looking at the chronology, the 1876, 1883, 1908 forest fires were a major factor in the forest. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. In 1911, the town constructed a road to Ricker's Mills. And so that indicated that before that time, there really was closed to access other than hikers and people on horseback. The state made its first acquisition for Groton State Forest in 1919. And so that really is when the state forest began, and the state bought essentially forest land which had been lumbered off by the mills, and so they tended to do that and accumulated the state forest. In 1931, the town built a road to the south end of Groton Pond from Rickers. So that was in 1931. 1933, the CCC boys built the road from Rickers Mills to Groton Pond. And that actually was the State Forest Road. So if you look at it, it wasn't until 1933 that there was access by road to Groton Pond and through the forest. That meant there was a period of 60 years where the only transport to the pond was the railroad. And it was very, very important to campers. The camps began to appear on the pond long around 1900. And we'll cover a little bit of that later on. 1934, 232 was built, and Stillwater Campground and picnic areas were completed by the CCC boys. Forest Road widened. 1938, the hurricane. 1947, electricity came to the north end. And 1955, Boulder Beach Road was constructed. So again, it's been a very late history. 56 was the last train through the forest. So that was the end of the railroad. 59, construction of the road around the north end. And in 61, Boulder Beach Road opened. As a neighbor of Boulder Beach Road, I can say that there was a lot of apprehension when the state opened Boulder Beach. We were sure it was going to be Coney Island, and it just didn't happen that way. So the state's been a very good neighbor. In 1965, telephone arrived with Molly's Pond Phone Company. 66, the dam was constructed by the state at the bottom of the lake, which stabilized the level of water, and we'll spend some more time on that. And in 1987, West Shore Road was constructed. In looking at this map, and it's hard to see, but this is a map in 1873, and you can see the railroad coming from the left down through the state forest. There are no other roads, and you can see a spur going up to Lakeside at the bottom of the pond. And again, this was to access lumber mills at that site. That was a critical site for lumber mills throughout the history. The railroad continued through Lund Pond, which is Rickers Pond, obviously. And if you look at the map, you'll see that there were a number of houses in the Ricker Pond area. And that, again, reflected the fact that it was easier to get to Ricker Pond. And so civilization did evolve from that area. Railroad was, as I say, vitally important. It's interesting that in the 38-mile stretch between Wells River and Montpelier, Lanesboro is the high point. Lanesboro is about 1,000 feet higher than Wells River and about 800 feet higher than Montpelier. So it took a lot of horsepower to get up those grades. And if you've ever walked or bicycled from Boulder Beach Road to the Upper Valley Grill, you know that it's a lot easier going down than coming back. And that's what the trains dealt with. And in this case, you'll see that this is pictured as a double header with 2 engines, and they often used it. The train was used for lumber. Train was very important to granite industry, to the ice industry, as well as to the communities of Groton and Lanesboro. It used to be used as a commuter train for school children to go from Lakeside to Groton schools. So it was very important. And there were all sorts of specialty trains, such as for the fair. High school classes would get a train for a class day swimming at Lakeside in the pond. So it was very much a part of society. And it's hard to imagine what society and life would have been without the railroad in those days. This is Lakeside Station. And actually, this is the picture normally seen for Lakeside Station. Actually, this is the second Lakeside Station. The first station burned in 1883 in a forest fire. And let me digress for a minute on that forest fire. Forest fire of 1883 was supposedly the largest forest fire in the state of Vermont's history. It burned 2,000 acres. It destroyed, obviously, the station, destroyed the lumber mill at Lakeside. It also went up the tracks and destroyed lumber mill at Peabody, which is at the Boulder Beach Road crossing. And it's destroyed numerous houses, animals, what have you, in the Lakeside area. And the accounts of the forest fire talks in terms of 75 people who were resident of Lakeside having to take refuge in the pond or on the pond because of the fire. So they were essentially trapped at Lakeside. So it was a monumental forest fire.
Where was that?
Pardon?
Where was
This
Lakeside Station?
Lakeside Station was right where Lakeside Drive crosses the railroad bed.
Okay.
And in fact, if you take a right on the railroad bed and go up a little ways to your left, you will see a cellar hole
Okay.
that is still there. And so you can easily find that cellar hole along the railroad bed. But obviously this was rebuilt, and I couldn't figure out why this station looks so different, because it does not look like a railroad station, and it's because this was privately owned, obviously by the lumber yards, and it housed 30 men upstairs, as well as a post office store, and it was a key part of the Lakeside community. I've never seen a picture of the original Lakeside Station, which only lasted 10 years.
Would the train back up that spur and then go down it? How did that, it's such a sharp,
Yes, it is at an angle, and I've wondered that myself in terms of
how they
how
got
the
themselves out
trains
there?
do that. But I have a feeling that they had a way that it could go around that corner. This is Rocky Point Station. This was located about halfway up between Lakeside Drive and West Shore Drive on the west side. And this was a key access point for people going to the lake, and that they would go to this station, disembark there, go down a steep hill, if you're familiar with that area, to access boats. And so this was a key point for, as I say, accessing the lake. And if you walk along that section of the railroad bed, you will see these rock formations. It's massive and very distinctive.
Can you see them from the lake?
No, you can't see it from the lake. It's so much higher than the lake.
Okay.
This is a second flag stop at Stillwater, and it is located above Boulder Beach Road on the railroad bed, or was located. And this is called the Tin Pan Alley Flag Stop, also called the Stillwater Flag Stop. And here you see a young family. This picture was taken in about 1948. At this time, gas was at a premium and non-existent, so railroad was the mode of transportation. To get to this point, I happen to be familiar with this family.
That's you, Dave, right, the little boy?
Yes, that's it. They had to row a half a mile across the lake, get off at Stillwater, and then climb for 3/4 of a mile up the hill to get to this flag stop.
And leave the boat.
Pardon?
And where would you leave the boat?
The boat would left at Stillwater. Stillwater used to be a public parking ground for boats by the state. And so people would build ramps to store their boats, and they'd pull them up on the boulders that were in evidence at that position and leave their boats. To access camps from Stillwater, because as I say, it was a half a mile for us across the lake, each camp had its own set of horn blows that were used to communicate to the camp. So in the case of our camp, someone arriving would drive down to Stillwater, they'd blow their horn 5 short times, and we would know that there's someone visiting us. And so each family had their own signal for horn blows. And things got a little dicey in a strong wind or rainstorm, and so there were flashing of lights as well and on other mechanisms. Many people commuted out of Stillwater to work in those days. During the summertime, they would come up with their families, leave their families, and go to work in Barre or Montpelier or Groton via parking at Stillwater. This is timetable that was effective at that time, and as you'll see, it has Lanesboro and Lakeside as listed on the phone. This was the mill, Hazen's Mill at Groton Pond. This is at the foot of the pond. As I say, a lakeside community, and if you study the picture, it's a massive operation. And in this case, showing oxen as well as horses. If you study the picture, you see that the men look like they're standing on ice, and I'm sure it was. The winter time was a key time in lake history because it allowed access across the pond, easy access across the pond.
Are those the
I was gonna say those-
sawdust?
Yeah,
piles?
those little mountains and those tiny mountains and the.
Yes, these are sawdust piles.
Those are the ones that got on fire? And
Yes, and they would catch on fire, and they had to caution kids about playing on the sawdust fire because they would fall through the sawdust into burned sections of the sawdust pile.
it started just by spontaneous combustion sort of deal?
Well, or they just smoldered underneath in the center of the pile.
Huh.
So they were very dangerous for people and especially children.
That sounds vile.
Again, another view of the logging. The typical calendar was as follows, in that in November and December, they would cut the trees in the forest And then in the later part of the winter, they would skid them down to the east side of Groton Pond to a place called the log pile. And then in the summer, they would float them down the pond to the mill at the bottom. And here again, you see the logs, and it would take them through most of the summer to float down all of the logs that they had accumulated in the winter time.
And they did that with a steamer? Is that when they used the steamer to pull them?
Good question. This shows a rig, it's a sketch, since we don't have a photograph, of how the logs were tied together and towed down the pond. And they were transported, as I say, all summer long, and it was pulled by a steamer. And actually, there were 4 different steamers at different times in this point in history. And sometimes the logs would sink. And if you've done deep diving in Groton Pond, you know that there are a number of logs still on the bottom of Groton Pond. Here's a picture of the steamer. And the steamer was used to transport people as well, and that the steamer would take people to their camps or take provisions to camps on their way to picking up another load of logs. And so it was very much a part of the pond history. This is a picture of a sawmill foundation, in that there are very few remnants left of the sawmills. The Peabody Mill by Stillwater, again, there's traces of cellar holes. It's about all you'll find there. And as I say, you'll find a cellar hole in the lakeside. But otherwise, there are very few remnants. In this case, apparently this was a Civil War era sawmill located on Coldwater Brook. And if you go to the Nature Center and go up Coldwater Brook Trail, you'll see this on the other side of the brook. So it's very interesting.
It's almost at the base of Big Deer Mountain.
Yes. Well, it is, yes.
So
But
this is
it-
where the water would come in, and it was forced to be close together, so it was strong enough to run
Yes.
a water wheel.
Yes.
This was an up and down sawmill. So the boards would be dropped down from the upper floor down to the bottom floor.
So this is a very lovely spot of the brook as well.
Was there a pond that went with it, or no?
No,
Okay.
no, it was just, there's a little falls here, which shows where the water had some force. This is a picture of the construction of Route 232. It shows what the CCC boys dealt with in building Route 232. It's amazing when you think of it.
How many of them were there? How many CC workers were there up here, do you think?
I've forgotten. I've seen pictures of the CCC camp, and it was in the hundreds, meaning you're talking 200-300 CCC boys per camp.
And they stayed up here for a year, or?
They were there from 33 to 37, I believe.
Oh.
And there was a camp at Ricker Mills, near Ricker Sawmill, and there was one in near Osmo Pond.
It was a building that was right by 232 that the roof fell in
Yes.
on. And that was one of the places they stayed, or something?
Yes,
No,
that
was a
one.
garage. That was one of their utility garages.
Oh.
Yes.
Harold
Actually-
Miller from town came to Groton because he worked for the CCC.
Rob Miller.
Harold Miller.
Harold Miller. Oh,
That
Harold
married
Miller.
Peg Miller.
Oh, sure, okay.
Yeah, he was the
Oh,
worker.
yeah.
That's how we met Peg.
How did they get paid?
They,
It was, I think they were paid something like $1 a day,
Uh-huh.
And they had to send a certain percentage of that home to their families.
That was part of the law that,
Yes,
uh-huh.
yes.
And they learned skills. Well, they had a library and a classroom,
Huh,
and so it was a work learning program for
and it
them.
was federal.
It was
not-
Yes.
federal under
Roosevelt.
President Roosevelt,
Oh,
part of the New Deal.
If you go up by Osmore Pond, there's a lot of signs left, chimneys, sort of the CCC camp that was at that
it-
location.
that's where they lived.
It's very interesting, yes. That was a CCC camp, and Alan said there was also one at Rickers. I think the one from Osmore Pond, they were primarily recruited from Rhode Island,
Huh,
came up, and
so somehow or other Vermont got the money for that,
It was federal money.
like our senator or something like that.
I don't know, but there's two places you can find some of the history. One is on the Spore family website in Groton Pond, right?
I don't think it's there
Well,
anymore.
it's not there anymore. Well, the other place is you can look online for CCC camps in Vermont and in Groton.
Cool.
But the CCC boys were very important to the state forest, and if you look at things like the picnic shelters at Owl's Head or at Stillwater, they're things of beauty and they've lasted.
You said went up to Owl's Head. If you walked up those stairs,
Yeah,
those were built by the CCC.
I was thinking about.
Yes, this was constructed by the CCC boys.
Somebody must have taught them how to do masonry.
Well, that, as Alan was saying, it was a skills transfer, and so learning how to deal in stone was obviously one of the skills that got transferred.
And I just read recently something on it, and it lists the name of the person who was the head mason and did all the teaching on that. I can't remember if it was on the Groton Historical Society or the Lake Groton information.
All right, this is a picture of the log pile, or the location of the log pile. And the reason why I include this is to show you the beach. And this was the level of the water before the dam was built in 1966 by the state. And the water level was a constant problem in the pond, mainly because if the water level went down, rocks suddenly popped up and rocks destroyed motors. Here's another picture. This is the rock that is in front of the Scharfschmidt camp. And if you recognize it, what's there today, you can only see the top, probably foot or 18 inches. So it's very dramatic on the water level. And here again is a picture of the rugged shore with boulders exposed. And this is a picture of the Lake Association, which came about in 1947. And the Lake Association had two primary functions. One was to work on the dam at the bottom of the lake and maintain it. The second was to maintain a dock at Stillwater. As I say, boats were parked at Stillwater for access to the outside world, and so they worked on maintaining that dock. And here you see a picture of men standing on a wooden dam, and this was the state of the dam before 1966. Every year, they used to have work parties where the men would take rugs and mattresses and anything else that they could down and stuff them in the dam to stem the water flow. And this is the current dam. If you're not familiar with it, it's a beautiful dam, and the state built this in '66, and they restored it in 2011. So it's it does a beautiful job.
So, Dave, do you know, I don't, like, as a kid, I used to boat down there, but we also would walk down the railroad bed and like cut across.
That's
Is there
correct.
It's
Is
still
there
there.
That road's still there, but they've got the state has put a bar across, but you can still walk in that way, yes.
Well, but so I just biked that last week,
Yeah.
and I
Yes.
looked and I tried to find like the path, and I couldn't, but it's been a long time since I've come that way.
It's right by a gate on the railroad bed.
Near the,
And near
near
Ricker's
the Ricker
Pond.
Pond
It's closer
campground.
to Ricker's Pond.
Yes.
So it's like the gate, and then is it a little bit?
Yes,
like,
very distinctive.
It is.
And so you can park at Lakeside Drive and walk down there easily to get to the dam.
I'd like to bring the kiddos, because I used to go and picnic there all the time.
Yes, it's a neat swimming hole there.
It is.
All right, and again, this was rebuilding the dam in 2011. All right, I'd like to just show you the type of fish which came out of Groton Pond. You can't catch this anymore, but this was a 4.5-foot long northern pike caught by Dougie Lothrop, and I don't know the date.
Yeah, probably 50, is in the late
It was
50s,
probably
but-
in the 50s, yes. But due to climate change and the warmth of the water, northern pikes no longer inhabit Lake Groton. There it is again. All right, in looking at camps, camps came into being in the 1890s and the early 1900s. Here you see 3 camps interspersed with piles of logs. The leftmost camp is the Clark Camp up at the head of the pond. And the other people are Pillsbury and Carpenter.
That was before 1908, because there's another camp that was built in 1908 that's not in that picture.
We think the rightmost camp is Rusty Reeder's camp. This is an interesting picture for a couple reasons. First of all, you can look at the nature of the forestation around the camps, and this reflects the forest fires. And when these camps were built, and we think it was in the 1914 timeframe, it still was recovering from the 1906 fire. And the camp on the right is the Tex La Rosa camp. An interesting story, I talked about ice being a critical factor, and that camp was originally on Berlin Pond. And it was loaded on a flat car, taken apart, loaded on a flat car, brought out to Groton, and taken across the ice and reconstructed in this location.
Where is Berlin Pond?
Montpelier, Berlin, very
Yeah.
area.
Montpelier water source.
And the leftmost camp is the Bloom Camp, Red Camp, which some of you may know. This was probably the first camp on the lake, or the site of it, and that was at the Plainfield Camp, which is about halfway on the east shore. And this showed camping, and I think the date of this picture was 1896. And so it was a very interesting time, and that was apparently the Plainfield Camp was about the first camp on the pond. And again, partial construction of a kitchen. And when you look at some of these pictures, this was before screen windows and screen doors were invented. So June would have been a very long month, and it's why most people came up for July and August, and June belonged to the black flies. This is the Gare Camp, which was probably the second camp constructed on the lake. This is on the west shore, and is still there today. It's a bright green camp about halfway on the west shore. Just a picture of the insides, and this reflected the current architecture for the day of pretty crude rough sawn lumber for interior. This shows a group of men, and very likely it was taken at hunting season. Camps were used for two reasons. One, during July and August for family time, and the second part was in November for hunting season. This is Camp Wildwood, which has a date of 1903 on it, and it's still standing. This is Camp Wildwood today. This is Greystone, and this was built by Charles Lord, who was Allen's grandfather, and Greystone still exists, although a couple of years ago, Allen moved it back 60 feet and built a new version of Greystone on the front. But it's certainly one of the oldest. This is a picture of showing two things. One, the steamer, or a version of the steamer, and the second is a little girl, is Alice Godine. Some of you may remember Alice Godine. And the boat to the left, or to the right, is also named Alice. Alice was a boat built by Charles Lord. It had a 2 horsepower inboard motor, and was state of the art at the time. This is the Alice, reconstituted by Ben Clark as the 08. And so the Alice continued to be used. This is the Alice today. The Alice today is sitting in John LaRosa's garage, where he's rebuilt it, and it's been a major operation, the reconstruction of Alice. And when I took this picture about a month ago, he said he had about 8 more coats of varnish to go on before launching it, and he was hoping to launch it this fall. And he's planning to use a solar engine in the reconstruction of the boat.
He hasn't launched it yet, though.
No,
I don't think so.
no, I was there 2 weeks ago. He said he still said he wants to put it in the water this fall.
It's a thing of beauty. Aluminum boats were a great step forward in rowboats. And before this time, we were living on wooden boats, extremely heavy, and they had to be soaked in springtime to close the cracks in the boat before being floated. This is a picture of a fiberglass boat in about 1960. And I included this for a couple reasons. First of all, to show a boathouse. And boathouses are really a thing of the past. But in the past, if you were going to have a boat on the lake, you had to have a place to store it, especially if it had a varnished or finished deck. And so boathouses exist. And now boathouses are non-existent items or deteriorating and being used for other reasons because people pull their boats out and put them on a trailer and store them in a garage. The second part is if you had a boathouse, you had to have a way of getting the boat into it. So it shows the track here, and they used to be a very common thing to see the tracks into the water from around the lake. And again, this has disappeared. But the tracks and the mechanisms provided of major projects for people to work on. In this case, the mechanism would pull the boat into the boathouse was made from an old washing machine motor, which Ernie Desilette constructed for that purpose.
And how are you so familiar with that boat?
I spent a lot of hours on that boat. And again, this is summer school teachers in a boat in 1914. And again, you can see the state of the art of boat building. The boat was undoubtedly built of 1-inch lumber, 1-inch boards, and extremely tough to row, extremely heavy. I forgot to mention that the fact of people climbing from the railroad station, Rocky Point, down to the station, to the camps. And the thing that you see in some of the old pictures are the women dressed in long skirts with their hats, making that journey in the summertime.
And then rowing across in one of those boats.
Yes. As I was putting this material together, I started thinking about just the changes which have happened over the years. And this is a picture of a scuffy moose at the site of 232 in 2005. And in that time period, it was not unusual to see moose alongside the road. So I started writing down the increases in recent years. We see in the forest things like moose and bear and turkey, eagles, geese, coyotes, bobcats, ticks, and bladderworts is all things that didn't exist 50 years ago that exist today in the forest.
What's a bladderwort?
And so somehow our ecology does work. Some of the decreases, you don't see many deer anymore. Bats used to be a thing of constant thing you saw. If out fishing at night, you constantly bombarded by bats. Northern pike, as we mentioned, and whippoorwills, which we used to have.
Dave, what is a bladderwort?
Pardon?
Bladderwort.
Bladderwort, is it a plant?
The state says it's a non-invasive plant. It's actually fairly invasive in the lake. It grows off, it isn't rooted on the bottom of the lake, but it feeds off the bacteria and the debris in the bottom of the lake.
Is it the clumps of
It's the
stuff?
clumps of green stuff that
Like,
come
I
up.
think,
Yes.
like it's all
Yeah,
over the
that-
place
yes,
now.
it is.
I think that's the stuff you covered yourself in the
Yeah,
summer.
yes, and you're absolutely correct. That's what it is.
Bladderwort really happened to the pond out of nowhere probably 3 or 4 years ago.
After Hurricane Irene,
Yeah.
Yeah, I never noticed it, but I thought it would.
And it was very thick for a couple years, and last year it seemed to go away. This year, it wasn't there in the beginning, and then it came out in the middle of the summer. So it's a weed form that the Lake Groton Association has been working on keeping under control.
And what is a whippoorwill?
Whippoorwill is a bird. And whippoorwill used to be very prevalent in the forest at night, right at dusk. As a kid, I can remember going to sleep listening to whippoorwills.
and they would, the song that they would sing would be a whippoorwill. That's why they got named. You could actually hear them almost say that word.
And they lived off of mosquitoes. And
We've reintroduced the loon, right? I mean,
But
maybe the whippoorwill could be reintroduced, like, everyone seems quite nostalgic about the whippoorwill. If you had one of these, I wonder what it would take to bring the
Yes.
whippoorwill back.
well, unfortunately, the whippoorwill was almost completely wiped out by DDT,
Uh-huh.
which was sprayed to kill mosquitoes. And then the whippoorwills lived on mosquitoes, and so
Huh.
they didn't survive because of that.
But they exist somewhere, maybe. I mean,
So their parent, every once in a while I hear that they're coming back.
You hear, oh, they just are, you hear
Yeah,
them.
so but they haven't come back very fast.
Because turkeys and eagles and loons were gone,
They weren't here.
and they're back now with
Yes.
effort, right? The loons
Yes.
especially.
So as
I don't think I've ever heard my mother talk, and she grew up on the lake, about a loon being there from the 1900s on
Yeah.
until the last 10 or 15 years.
And now there's an eagle too that harasses.
There were
the
three,
Yes.
there were three the other day.
loons. Oh, there were 3 the other day, oh my goodness.
yes,
I've
so
often wondered why the turkey is spoken of with such degradation. What a turkey. Like, why? I've been looking for the reason as to why the turkey has that reputation. Anybody?
They're not supposed to be a very smart bird.
They're stupid.
I would guess that that comes about in talking about domesticated turkeys, not wild turkeys. Because I think the domestic turkey is a totally different bird with a different mental state.
Personality or whatever. Interesting.
Because a wild turkey can fly, but a domesticated turkey can't.
Yep, yep.
Anyways.
All right, and this is just a final foil, and it just talks about some of the items, reading material that is on the Groton Pond website. And some of it is fascinating to read some of the diaries and some of the material of the early days on the pond. And one of the ones that is listed there is Camping at the Pond by Marion Proutfit. And again, they have copies of that, the new version, outside the door. So, any questions or comments?
Just a statement that it seems to me that people were pretty rugged back in the day, because just walking through the state forest now, it's just a cluster of boulders and rocks, and it just seems like they had to be really hard, rugged people to get up in there and.
Yes, no, it is fascinating to see when there's clear cutting of the forest, what is left, and it's just unbelievably rough terrain in terms of the boulders and the rocks. And when you look at that, you realize that the only crop that is practical is that of logging
Yeah.
and lumber, trees.
If you want to see a good example of that, drive up what we used to call the dead end, the road that goes up to the snowmobile trails.
Yep.
And they've logged extensively up there, and they clear cut it. And it's like looking at a field of boulders and boulders and boulders. It's amazing. You had a question over here, David?
Yeah, it's not too late, to Ricker, that my father lived in the Green Bay section of Beecham. And he used to talk about bringing logs over to Ricker Mill
Yes,
from Green Bay.
Sure, on the old county road.
Yeah.
yes. Ricker Mill was one of the last family-run mills, or it had a distinction of something like that in the country. And it lasted for a long time. I don't know the date of when
It stopped running in the early 70s. And there's some pictures out here of the people that ran it. One of the younger men was one of my classmates in Groton High School.
He would have come across probably in 1915s, 1920s, somewhere in that.
Yes.
And the mill was the first mill, Ricker Mills, that site was the site of the first mill in Groton.
Yes,
And that was in the early 1700s.
yeah, I think that the distinction I'm thinking of, maybe it was the longest continuously running mill in the country, something of that sort, but it was, I remember it well.
Yeah, some type of machinery too. What about Levi Pond? Is that ever a part of anything that anybody knows?
It doesn't have a lot of access for one thing. and two, it's really quite small.
Yeah.
And I don't hear, I've been there many times, but I don't hear much about the history of it, except that on the mountain behind it, which is called Jerry Lund Mountain, there was a farmstead up there in the late 1800s.
There's a farm.
And
It
Jerry,
wasn't
Jerry,
long.
Jerry Lund
Uh-huh.
was the owner of the farmstead.
All right, again, I encourage you to enjoy the pictures in the back. There's some more in addition to the ones I've shown. And there's also a bathing suit exhibition in the living room section of this house, so
Want to show you something?
would encourage you.
I want to show you.